Draft season is officially here, and we are about to hit the biggest draft weekend of the year before NFL football starts just next week. It is as important to know who you don't want to draft as it is to know who you do want to draft. And in this video, I'm going to give you 6 players who I think you need to be avoiding this season. And this is for a few different reasons, whether it's risk, whether it's draft cost, whether it's injury issues, or whether I just don't think they're going to perform to their current value. If you like this sort of content, please consider liking and subscribing, but let's start with the big one. Jacory Croskey-Merritt has been one of the biggest risers of this offseason. He was a draft prospect that people absolutely sweared about, and people thought that he was a guaranteed sleeper when he went all the way down at the 7th round to the Washington Commanders. Now, this is one of the draft spots that people really liked, so it was seen as a little bit exciting for a player that some people really liked as a prospect. Now, when it comes to JCM as a prospect, I didn't particularly mind him. I had him relatively low in my rankings. I thought I saw a tremendous one-cut ability, a really good ability to work through contact, but also a back that liked finding contact way too much, lacked some of that elusiveness, and was a complete non-factor in the passing game. Now, it's really important to note that because of eligibility issues, Croskey-Merritt only played 1 game last season, so he is coming relatively raw into the NFL, despite being a 24-year-old prospect. Now, the big thing with Croskey-Merritt is there was a huge amount of camp hype for him, and then Brian Robinson, the presumed starter at running back, was traded to the San Francisco 49ers. So now Croskey-Merritt is seen as one of the biggest risers and someone that you need to be drafting. The problem that I have with Croskey-Merritt is he is per Fantasy Pros real-time ADP, now going as high as the 9th round as the running back 36. I've actually in some drafts seen him go even higher, including reports on Twitter of him going in the 5th and 6th rounds. He has ridden around 24 spots in rankings in the last week alone. He is clearly the biggest story of this offseason, but I think that draft cost is far too high. To me, I am more likely to look at Austin Ekeler as the starting back in Washington, and I think the reporting has been that they will mix in Croskey-Merritt and Chris Rodriguez, as well as Ekeler himself. JCM not being a factor at all in the passing game just limits his upside. Then the upside is also limited by having Jaden Daniels, who is going to score a fair amount of rushing touchdowns on his own. For the current price you have to pay for him, a 7th round pick is unlikely to ever contribute that much. And I know people will look at examples from the last few years of someone like James Robinson, or even the last couple of years, Isaiah Pacheco, that went late down the board. But for every one player you can find who was a really late pick, who ended up becoming something really exciting in the NFL, there are going to be 10, 20, 30 more who never did anything that we all got very excited about. To me, I always find it a little bit suspicious when players massively rise before football starts, and I know the opportunity is there for Croskey-Merritt to succeed, but given he's currently going in the 9th round, and when that ADP updates it might be close to the 7th or the 8th, the cost is just too high for me. Now, I'm perfectly willing to be wrong on this one, but there are other players in this range that I would prefer. So Croskey-Merritt to me is someone that at this cost, I'm going to be avoiding. Next up, we have Breece Hall, currently being drafted as the running back 15. Now, Breece's ADP has slipped throughout this offseason, and that is not a huge surprise as people start to fear how stagnant this Jets offense could be. A huge part of the issue for Breece Hall is that he has thrived off receptions. In fact, the last couple of seasons where he's finished really highly, he has finished with under 1,000 rushing yards and only a few touchdowns. He's just performed highly in fantasy because of getting those dump-offs. But there is going to be a huge change going from Aaron Rodgers, who checked down at the highest rate last season, to Justin Fields, who is obviously a mobile quarterback who is more likely to take off on his own. Breece Hall, without the huge volume of receptions, is a slightly more worrying back. Last season, they only saw 4 rushing defenses in the top 10 in DVOA. In those games, Breece Hall averaged 34.8 yards per game and just 3 yards per carry. Breece Hall has really struggled against good rushing defenses across his time in the NFL, but has obviously been able to make it work for fantasy because of his receiving work. If the Jets' offense is far more stagnant, if those rushing touchdowns are going to be limited, and if the reception work is going to be incredibly limited by the fact that Justin Fields is probably in the NFL the quarterback most likely to just try and escape the pocket and see what he can do, then Breece Hall's upside is just incredibly limited as it is. I still think he's a fantastically exciting back, but combined with the fact that this team has spent the entire offseason talking up Braylon Allen, it could be that Breece Hall finds himself with just third down work or limited to maybe explosive plays only. If Braylon Allen were to steal the goal line work, this would be a huge downgrade for Breece Hall. Now, his ADP has really been sliding this offseason, so RB15 cost is probably not too high that it's going to really mess up your draft, but looking around the running backs in the same range, there are so many that I would prefer over Breece, or even taking a wide receiver at the 3-4 turn where he tends to go. To me, the Jets offense is just such a worry that I think Breece is going to be the biggest loser. So he is making my do not draft list this year. If you're enjoying this video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. There is so much more content coming your way this offseason and when the season starts just next week. So click that subscribe button, get involved, and get ready for the season to begin. Next up, we have Tyreek Hill. Now, Tyreek Hill is currently going as the wide receiver 12, and it's really interesting this offseason. It's the first time you've been able to get Tyreek outside of the top 7 wide receivers since 2018, but a lot of that comes down to his performance last season, and then there are a fair few reasons where it could go wrong for Tyreek going into this year, and given where he's drafted, I think he's probably one of the riskier players on the board. When we take a look at last season, he finished with under 1,000 receiving yards for the first time, or the second time since 2018, but the first time playing every single game since that mark. And you take a look at Tyreek last year, and one of the most important facts in Tyreek Hill's game across his time in fantasy football is those explosive week winning performances, and he had just 4 weeks last season of 20 plus fantasy points, his lowest mark in the last few years. Then when you take a look going into this next season, first of all we have the fact that he is currently not practicing due to having an oblique injury. Not that I foresee that being a huge issue, but it is noteworthy that he is still not practicing. But there are 3 reasons that I can think of why Tyreek Hill could fall to pieces this next season. The first thing is Tyreek himself. Obviously, Tyreek is getting up there in age at 31, and as a player who relied exclusively on that explosive speed, losing that could be a huge issue. Last year, we saw some of his lowest totals in yards per touch in his entire career. And just from the eye test, it seemed like he was losing a little bit of that explosivity that we had previously. So if Tyreek Hill is on the way down, taking him at wide receiver 12 is just not going to produce on value. Then we have the Dolphins themselves. First of all is the Tua Tagovailoa problem. Tua obviously has struggled with health across the past few seasons, with concussions being the main issue. If Tua gets knocked out, that is a massive downgrade for Tyreek Hill. And it's seemingly relatively likely as he has not played a full 17-game season in the last couple of years. We also have that offensive line. Now, this was one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL last season, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be massively upgraded heading into this next year. So if the O-line is still struggling and you have Tua behind it also struggling, Tyreek Hill is not going to get those deep targets that are so valuable for him. The other factor in the Dolphins themselves is whether or not Mike McDaniel has just been figured out. The Mike McDaniel offense absolutely exploded onto the scene a few years ago, but last season looked really stagnant. It thrived around a Kyle Shanahan point of attack rushing game, but last season they could not run the ball at all. If they cannot figure out these offensive woes, that is going to mean that they just get shut down, and that could lead to Tyreek Hill being incredibly inefficient. The third and final factor, which makes him a bit of a bust for me, is that I think Tyreek Hill could easily get cut or traded during this season. His cap hit is absolutely gigantic, and there have already been talks about whether or not the Dolphins might want to move on from him, especially if the offense isn't working and they look to enter a rebuild going into the 2026 season. If the offense is stagnant and if Tua is unhealthy and Tyreek is then moved on, it just makes him such a risky pick. It's so rare to see a wide receiver moved during the season and continue to produce value when he's in the new situation. Plus, we have no idea where that's going to be. It could be back in Kansas City, in which case wheels up for Tyreek, but it could be absolutely anywhere. The combination of those factors just make Tyreek one of the riskiest picks in fantasy football for me, and given that he is still going inside the top 12 wide receivers, he's someone that I'll be avoiding at that cost. Next up, and sticking at the wide receiver position, we have Devonta Smith, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 23, so likely going to be your wide receiver 2 on your team. Devonta Smith last season finished as the wide receiver 27, but when you look at expected fantasy points, he was wide receiver 40. Devonta Smith ran incredibly pure last season and scored a fair amount of touchdowns, which really helped him out, given that he had less than 90 targets and less than 70 receptions last season. But those 8 touchdowns and some massive spike weeks massively helped his value. Part of the issue with Devonta Smith comes down to the Eagles themselves. Devonta Smith, if he is going to succeed and outproduce this value, is going to have to rely on, first of all, an AJ Brown or Dallas Goedert injury just to maintain some consistency in the passing game. The Eagles had the fewest pass attempts per game of any team in the NFL last season, due to how dominant that offensive line and Saquon Barkley in the backfield was, and then Jalen Hurts as well as a rusher. If Devonta Smith is going to succeed, he needs a few things to happen, which is the running game has to get worse, Saquon Barkley has to either be injured or not produce at the same level, the Eagles have to choose to pass the ball more, so maybe their defense has to be worse as well. They have to be more in fourth quarters and needing to pass the ball, and then likely he also needs AJ Brown to be injured. Devonta Smith is going to have his spike weeks. There are going to be days and games where he runs pure, where he scores the touchdown, where he gets the deep reception, but the volume for where you are buying him is just not worth what you are paying the price of. Devonta Smith is always likely to be a relatively inconsistent player so long as the Eagles are as dominant on the ground as they are projected to be and as they have been for last season. The path for Devonta Smith to finish as a top 12 wide receiver or even top 15 wide receiver is just so narrow, and to me, I'm happy to buy the margin on another player with a more stable floor and a higher ceiling than try and gamble on multiple injuries and changes in offense for my wide receiver 2 to see some success. Next up, we have Travis Kelce, who obviously has been in the news for a number of reasons this week, but for me, he is a massive avoid this season. Travis Kelce is still being drafted as the tight end 5, which was, to be fair, where he finished last season. But at the tight end position, finishing as the tight end 5 is pretty irrelevant, dependent on how you actually score. And Travis Kelce finished 120 points behind the mark a couple of seasons ago, where he finished as the tight end 1. Travis Kelce's weekly upside is just not really there for me right now because of the other factors in this offense, because of the way his body is starting to decline as he gets not just into his 30s, but close to his 40s. He is in his mid-30s at this point, and the way this offense is potentially looking to work, being built towards more explosive plays and looking deeper down the field. Taking him at tight end 5 just feels like a massive wasted pick for me because he has one of the lowest floors of any players you can draft right now. When it comes to Kelce himself, he will still get his and he will still be peppered with targets in the usual way. But it wouldn't surprise me if they look to, as they did last year, save him for the second half of the season. If you are taking someone at the tight end 5 in the 5th or 6th round, it needs to be someone that you're confident starting week in, week out. And when it comes to my rankings, I would prefer some other players later on down the board to Travis Kelce himself. If you're going to have to wait until after the bye for him to really be a league-winning player, why not let someone else take him and look to trade for him after week 5 or 6 when he's been quite disappointing? Tight end 5 cost for me just feels way too rich. I know it's where he finished last year, but personally I'm just not going to be paying that cost, and I've managed to get through the entire Travis Kelce section without a single Taylor Swift joke. Finally, we have Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers currently going as the wide receiver 36, and I think this is going to be a relatively controversial one because I know there are some real Ricky Pearsall truthers out there right now, and I know he is going to start the season as the wide receiver 1 on this team with Brandon Ayuk unhealthy, Juwan Jennings unhealthy with I want a new contract itis, and currently only Sky Moore opposite him in the wide receiver core. But to me, this more screams George Kittle 12 targets a game and Christian McCaffrey 8 targets a game than it does Ricky Pearsall to elevate himself into alpha wide receiver status. Him currently going as the wide receiver 36 is far too high for me for a player whose ceiling outcome is to be a top 24 wide receiver for the first 4 or 5 games of the season until Brandon Ayuk then comes back. But the crucial factor with me is that I only really want to draft players that I'm confident are good. Ricky Pearsall was someone that I didn't particularly like as a prospect last season, and then last season, obviously, he was limited due to the fact he was shot in the chest in the offseason, but when he did get going, he only finished with 2 games over 10 PPR points. Now, he had one particularly explosive game, but that is basically what everyone is basing things off. To me, this 49ers offense is always going to thrive on the ground, and the wide receiver 1 is always likely to only be the 3rd target in the team. Ricky Pearsall may be top of the depth chart for now, but that is not an exciting prospect to me, given the fact that I just think they'll throw the ball to Christian McCaffrey and George Kittle. And then, when Brandon Ayuk and Juwan Jennings come back, I expect him to be the wide receiver 3 on this team, which will make him the 5th target. I know he was a first round pick last season. I know he had that one huge breakout game, but Ricky Pearsall has not proven anything to me to show why he should be drafted inside the top 36 wide receivers. And yeah, that early season spike might see him finish around the wide receiver 30 to 32 mark, but in this range you want to be drafting someone who you think can finish inside the top 24, and I don't think he's more talented than Brandon Ayuk or Juwan Jennings, which means that I personally just don't see the pathway being there for him to have a top 24 finish at the position.